Hello, welcome to the Sunday School opening. I'm Ruth.
I'm Kira.
And this is the envelope of songs.
Do-do-do.
So what's going to come out of the envelope of songs?
Do-do-do.
You get to draw, Kira.
Yay.
What is it?
The joy.
Joy. Okay, we're going to play Sing Joy.
Joy.
Okay, we're going to jump that way first. Okay. Ready? Get ready at home. Now stand up. Here we go. Joy, 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 all the joy, 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 all the joy, 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 all the joy, 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 praise for Jesus, always for others. It's for you, Sing it again. Joy, 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 all the joy, 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 all the joy, 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 all the joy, 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 praise for Jesus, always for others. It's for you, Well, I hope you're having fun. We are. And it's time to draw again
Your
from the
turn.
envelope of songs.
Do-do-do.
I never get to draw. Oh, so exciting. Blessed be.
All right.
Okay, all right. You still standing up? Okay, because you got it for this.
Mhm.
Okay, 3, 4. Here we go. Blessed be the one who got up Israel from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be the one who got up Israel from everlasting to everlasting. And let all people say amen, amen. And let all people say amen, amen. And let all people say oh, praise the Lord. Whoop, whoop. Here we go. Whoop, whoop. One more time. Whoop, whoop. Yeah. Blessed be the one who got up Israel from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be the one who got up Israel from everlasting to everlasting. And let all people say amen, amen. And let all people say amen, amen. And let all people say amen. Oh, praise the Lord. Whoop, whoop. Here we go. Whoop, whoop. One more time. Whoop, whoop. Yeah.
All right.
Let's do another one.
One more time.
Okay, the envelope of songs.
Do-do-do.
Okay, your turn again. What will come out of the envelope of songs?
Books of the Old Testament.
All right, okay. Can you do this without the words? But you can.
Test of knowledge.
Here we go. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's the Pentateuch of Moses, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 2 Psalms, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. Sing a little song, get wise with the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Zeke and Dan, Hosea and Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah and Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and the last is Malachi. Okay, we got to do the New Testament. Yep, have to do it. Okay, I'll do the motions. I'll try. Okay,
Ready, go.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1, 2 Thessalonians, 2 Timothys and a Titus, Philemon and Hebrews and James and Peter, 1 and 2, 3 from John and 1 from Jude, and Revelation ends it, dude. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's enough for this installment. We'll see you another time. Bye.
Welcome to more of the Envelope of Songs.
Do-do-do.
If you didn't remember from before, I'm Mer,
And I'm Kira.
and we're going to draw from the Envelope of Songs.
Do-do-do. I'll do my best.
Oh, yay. Always try to do my best.
show.
So get your L's ready, S's, T's, and P. Okay. 3, 4. Here we go. Love,
Oh, love. Oh, love the Lord forever. Love. Oh, love. Oh, love the Lord forever. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Oh, oh, oh. Do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. I'll serve, serve. I'll serve the Lord forever. Serve. I'll serve. I'll serve the Lord forever. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Oh, oh, oh. Do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Trust, trust. I'll trust. I'll trust the Lord forever. Trust. I'll trust. I'll trust the Lord forever. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Oh, oh, oh. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Praise, praise. I'll praise. I'll praise the Lord forever. Praise. I'll praise. I'll praise the Lord forever. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Oh, oh, oh. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Love, love. Oh, love. Oh, love the Lord forever. Love. Oh, love. Oh, love the Lord forever. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you. Oh, oh, oh. I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Oh, I'll do my best for you.
Well, that was fun.
Right, time for another one, and it's your turn.
Yep, and we did our best.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
To draw out of the envelope of songs.
Doo-doo-doo. What will come out of the Envelope of Songs? Jesus rocks the world.
All right.
Okay. Got to stand up again because,
All the energy.
you got to do this every time Jesus rocks.
Mm-hmm. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus rocks the world. Jesus is the Lord of Lords. Jesus rocks the world. He rules the earth. He rules the sky. He's the holy God on high. Every tongue is gonna cry. Jesus rocks the world. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus rocks the world. Jesus is the Lord of Lords. Jesus rocks the world. He rules the earth. He rules the sky. He's the holy God on high. Every tongue is gonna cry. Jesus rocks the world.
Okay, get real quiet.
Whisper in the quiet moments. Jesus rocks the world. Speak it out a little louder. Jesus rocks the world. Louder. Say it so we all can hear it. Jesus rocks the world. Shout! Shout it out, tell everybody. Jesus rocks the world. He rules the earth. He rules the sky. He's the holy God on high. Every tongue is gonna cry. Jesus rocks the world. Jesus rocks the world. Hey, 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 hey. Jesus rocks the world. Hey, 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 hey. Jesus rocks the world. Once more. Hey, 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 hey. Jesus rocks the world. Hey, 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 hey. Jesus rocks the world.
Yeah, we're done.
Okay.
We could go on a long time.
Yes, we
Okay. Another song from the Envelope of Songs.
Do do do. Ain't no rock.
Ain't no rock. Yeah, get your axe ready.
Yes.
Whoops. There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Here we go. Ain't no rock gonna cry in my place. Long time alive, Lord, by His holy name. Ain't no rock gonna cry in my place. Long time alive, Lord, by His holy name. Lord, I know. Praise His holy name. Long time alive, Lord, by His holy name. Gonna sing in my place, lift my voice, glorify His holy name. Ain't no bird, squawk, squawk. Gonna sing in my place, lift my voice, glorify His holy name. Bring it down, praise His holy name. Up and live, glorify His holy name. Raise it loud, praise His holy name. Up and live, glorify His holy name. Sing it again, praise His holy name. Up and live, glorify His holy name. One more time, praise His holy name. Up and live, glorify His holy name.
And thank you for joining us. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was.
Woo! Welcome to the next installment.
Thank you, Mur and Kira, and welcome to our Bible study this morning. Good morning, CTK. As you know, my name's Nathan. I'm the minister of contemporary music, and with me I have Pastor Daniel, and he is here this morning to go over all of the genres of the Bible. I'm entering seminary in the fall, and I figure this is a great chance to get a crash course.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
I know nothing.
It's a starter course.
So teach me everything that you know, so I don't, maybe I can skip a couple classes when we get
Yeah,
into it.
well, and obviously everything we go over today is going to be very, very basic. It's going to be very surface level. But it is important for us to talk about narrative. And before you think we're going to blow through everything in 30 minutes, I think we're going to get to the end of Kings today. That's what I'm
Okay.
hoping for. So that's about half of the Old Testament.
And if you have any questions as we're going along, I have the chat open on YouTube, so put your questions in the chat. I'll bring them up to Pastor Daniel, and we can make this a little bit interactive.
And even if we've moved on from the book of the Bible that your question is for, please ask questions. We would much rather have this be interactive.
Yeah, we can jump around. It's cool. Yeah. So tell us about the first book.
Right. So overall, the narrative is the genre that we would use to talk about most of the Old Testament, at least what we're going to talk about today. And what do I mean by narrative? I mean that they're using stories to portray their relationship with God. So they're using stories to talk about their own identity. They're talking about who God is and the character of God. They're using stories to talk about why good things happened, why bad things happened, and they're phrasing all of that. And the reason why we use the word narrative is because it probably has some root in things that actually happened, but they're not trying to be historical. So that's like really important, right? You know, sometimes Disney will make a movie that's based on real events. You know what I'm talking about, Nathan?
Yeah.
But then they've altered the story to be a better story, right? They inflect things, they accentuate things, they make tall tales out of things. And one of the ways that happens most often, especially in the Old Testament, is when they use numbers to talk about things, right?
So does that mean the Bible's not literal?
This section of the Bible is definitely not meant to be literal. But when they talk about things like numbers, rather than saying somebody was really old, they'll say somebody was 600 years old or something like that, right? Goliath isn't a big man. He's 3 cubits, which is like 9 feet, okay? If you go to the American History Museum in Washington, D.C., and you see the evolution of humans, we get taller as time goes on. There are no bones of 9 feet people, but we tell those stories so that we can portray that this was an amazing thing that David did, right? That God helped David do. So let's start with Genesis. We know that there are 5 books in the Hebrew Pentateuch, penta meaning 5, tuch meaning book, that make up the Torah. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible and of our Christian Bible, and they have roots in them that are very ancient. They're probably maybe almost 3,000 years old in their roots. But that doesn't mean that the whole book is that way, because every time they write it down, they write stuff in on the margins, and then the next time somebody writes it down, they add the stuff in from the margins. So the things that come in the very beginning, like the title or the first line or something like that, are usually added last. Genesis is a good read. It has a lot of legends in it, like the Tower of Babel shows up in Genesis, the story of not just Adam and Eve, but Cain and Abel. Where does sin come from? Where does evil come from? But Genesis is considered a prehistory, meaning it was a prequel, right? So you've got Star Wars, A New Hope, and then years later, they start telling the story of Anakin as a prequel. You know what I'm talking about here?
So you're not supposed to watch Star Wars starting with episode 1.
Well, that's debatable, right? And just like now, you could read the Bible starting with Genesis. But the ancient Israelites would probably want you to read Exodus first. So Exodus is their first book of the Bible. And then Genesis was written as a prehistory, as an understanding of how the world came to be and how people came to be sort of good and evil. Right? I use quotes for this.
So remembering from your Genesis Bible study class, which if you haven't seen it, you didn't see it in person, it's on YouTube. It's really, really great. What I remember partially from that is that a good portion of Genesis, especially the creation story, isn't necessarily written directly by the Hebrew people or it originated from there.
Right. I mean, it's impossible to tell, but we know that some of the myths, some of the legends, some of the narrative in Genesis are found in other things. The Ugaritic creation story mirrors very closely to Adam and Eve. We know that the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is at least 100 years older, it has the notion of a snake or a serpent and a tree of life and eternal life and the quest to live forever, right? That was a very common tale, the quest to live forever. So the Genesis story, the creation narrative that we have in Genesis 2, sort of pre-assumes that we know the narrative of trying to live forever. And then they say, okay, well, we used to live forever, but now we don't, right? So they've sort of flipped that on its head. And the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, is a beautiful creation poem. And it should really be read that way, as a poem. It's got the cadence of a poem. Of course, it's been translated, so it doesn't rhyme, and that wasn't really their way of writing poems, was that it rhymed. But it's got a cadence to it. God did this, and there was light and there was darkness on the first day, and it was good. So that's like an A, B, C poem, right? And then God does this, and there was this, and it was good. So it just sort of keeps going that way. And then Genesis is, like I said, it's one of the ones I recommend that you read. I'll tell you those as we go along that I think are really helpful. So you ready to talk about Exodus?
I am so ready.
So Exodus is the root story of everything that happens in the Hebrew Bible. It starts out where the people are enslaved, and when they really first started calling themselves Hebrew people, and this is one of your questions from last week, they call themselves Hebrews, is during this time. Hebrew was a language. It was also a religion that was mostly monotheistic in a world that was polytheistic, right? So they believed in one God in a world that believed in multiple gods. And in fact, in Egypt, which we know is very polytheistic, you probably in school studied some of the ancient gods of...
Yeah, Ra and Osiris. And,
Yes, yeah, right. Kabuki. So there's a lot of great mythology that comes from ancient Egypt. And so the idea that there was one God was foreign to them. And in it, you get this story of Moses and his people going from slavery into freedom. This is an origin not of all people in the universe, but an origin of our people, of our tribe. And the theology that goes with a God who wants us to be free. And what happens in Exodus is that the people fight against that freedom. They start complaining as soon as they get into the wilderness that they would rather be enslaved because their things were routine.
That's human nature.
That is
I'm
human
always
nature.
asking, oh man, if I could just spend a day off at home, that would be wonderful. And then when we have it, it's like, ooh, I need to get outside. I need to get back to my routine.
And one of the things that's really important about Exodus is we start getting some of the priestly tradition. So Exodus 20 through 24 is the priestly code, which has in it the Ten Commandments, has in it that we should honor the Sabbath, which was the most important commandment. In terms of how much time you're spent writing about the Ten Commandments, they all go like boom, boom, boom. And then when they get to the Sabbath, it's like this long paragraph, right? Which tells us that it was considered really important. And that's the difference between slavery and freedom, is a day off. When you're a slave, you work every day. There's no cadence to life. There's no rest. There's no time to look back and observe. But the idea of Sabbath, that God rests on the seventh day, and so should we, is a good reminder that we are free, right? That we have been made free. So there's a lot that comes into that, and along the way, the people struggle a lot, and that's where we get to Leviticus.
My favorite book.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. So Leviticus is the laws. This is the code of conduct for how to be a Hebrew in the 10th or 9th century BCE. So this was the rule system for a governance model in that time. Of course, it borrows from the Code of Hammurabi, which is another text that was around that time, was a little bit earlier. Leviticus is not a great read. Genesis is a great read. Exodus is a great read. Leviticus you can skip because it's got a lot of things that just don't apply to us. And a lot of their rules were just rules that made sense. Why don't you eat shellfish? Well, because shrimp go bad if they're not refrigerated. And they have no freezers. They have no ice. Also, Jerusalem is really not close to a body of water, right? Mm-hmm. So it makes sense that they would have these rules in place.
I'm glad that you bring this up because I think this is one of the books of the Bible people struggle with most in accepting as modern day Christians because it just seems so out of touch with how we do our practices.
Right.
And so how should we as Christians approach the book of Leviticus? Should we include it in our readings at all?
Well, I mean, if you're going to do a deep dive into Scripture, of course you can read it. I mean, I wouldn't tell you not to read it, except a lot of people have asked, what are some that I should start with? Or if I want to be involved in the Bible while I'm stuck at home, what should I read? Leviticus would not be high on my list. It would be toward the very bottom of things that I would recommend that you read because it's just not that helpful for us in the 21st century in America and as Christians, where Peter struggles with a lot of these Levitical laws, and Paul does too in the New Testament. And some of that's sort of been figured out already. So let's keep moving to Numbers. Numbers is a funny book of the Bible. It's a narrative from the priestly point of view. You're seeing this picture here of donkeys because the story of Balaam and his talking ass, his talking donkey, is from Numbers chapter 22. And in it, you should obviously understand what genre you're in. This is a narrative, right? When the donkeys start talking, we're in narrative.
That's
right?
not literal.
That's probably not considered literal. Also, Genesis, a talking snake. We know snakes don't have the physical properties of having vocal cords. We know they don't, right? So the talking donkey should suggest that it's narrative. Numbers is also one that I wouldn't recommend that you read necessarily because it's from the priestly point of view. So we've got Exodus, which is like this tribal understanding of ourselves. Then we've got Genesis, which is like a prehistory and a creation. Then we're building on that, and we've got Leviticus, which are laws that we should follow about how to live an orderly, clean life in a very dirty world. And then we get to Numbers, and it's the priests saying, okay, now that we've got a number, the reason it's called Numbers is because Abraham was promised that his descendants would be so numerous that you couldn't count. And in Numbers, the number that they say is there are over 600,000 Israelites. Now, we know from archaeological data there are no such large numbers of Israelites. But the narrative is that some people are set aside from that. And what's really nice about Numbers as a pastor is that there's a lot of language about how the priests need to live their life differently. They're called the Levites. So of the 600,000 that are able to go to war and sort of establish a city-state of Jerusalem, the priests are left out. And we really use that today, Nathan. If a wartime came, right, I would end up being a chaplain, right? And if it comes not today, but 4 years from now, you would end up being a chaplain. It's sort of a set-aside responsibility, and we take that as a high honor as a pastor, that we're set aside. We are reserved to do certain things. Be there when people are dying, as Pastor Athena talked about in her sermon. Be there when people are born. Help pray with people. Be there for their wedding. Those are special roles, and you want people set aside for that.
So talking about that, the 600,000, we got a question from Peggy Hoffert. Do you believe in the symbolism of numbers that we find in the Bible?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Peggy. Well, right. So when they're using numbers, they're trying to portray something. So obviously 7 is a really perfect number. That's sort of, okay, so all life is order and chaos, right? When they use words like 7 and 3 and 12 and 40, they're talking about order. And they use those words to talk about, okay, God has rounded this up. God has made this complete. Something that was incomplete is now complete. It's whole. It's beautiful. When they use numbers like, I think it's 6,800. I don't think that number in Numbers is supposed to be like a pure, complete number. But it might be that in their minds, okay, it's like 680,000 plus the priest that they've taken out. Maybe that makes a round 700. So sometimes the number that we see is incomplete, but in their minds, they've added back in to make it a complete number. Which is really funny because what's promised to Abraham is that there will be so many descendants that you will not be able to count them.
Yeah. But
And
they
then
count.
But then they
to
count
680.
because that's what people do.
I have another question for you. So Coleman asked, doesn't Leviticus 13 teach us social distancing for diseases?
Leviticus 13.
Yes.
Hi, Coleman. I hope you're doing well. Right, it does. I mean, it does, because the purity law there is to say, when you're sick, you should stay away, right? And there's a lot of logic to that. They are trying to add order into chaos.
Yep.
This is a fledgling city-state. All of these are finally written down by the time that they have a city. They have Jerusalem. Why? Because you don't write things down on the road. Why? Because you have to make papyrus, and there's not papyrus when you're wandering in the desert. You don't have scribes until you have an educational system. You don't have an educational system until you collect taxes. You can't collect taxes until there's an economy. You can't collect an economy. There's not an economy until there are people who are domesticated, and they can't be domesticated until they stay in one spot and grow crops, right? So there's none of this gets written down in the wilderness. By the time they get to the city-state, they think, okay, we need these rules to obtain order in the midst of chaos. And so Leviticus 13 and the other laws, the holiness code, the purity laws, are about how we should stay safe. And of course, social distancing makes tons of sense, right?
Yeah.
If you're sick, you stay over there. You stay over there, right?
And so you were talking in the sermon a couple weeks ago about how Jesus even kept his distance from the lepers.
And healing the lepers, yeah. And it's sort of, it was made plain in the writing of Luke chapter 17, right?
Yeah.
That he kept his distance.
And
important
so
to know.
one more question from Dan and Dawn. Do you have recommendations of how to have positive, sensitive conversations with those who are who view or interpret the Bible as literal and unerring?
Yeah, hi Dan and Don. I've been thinking about you. Hope those horses are doing well. Yeah, and this comes up a lot, right? How do you have conversation with people who just know that it's all, inerrant or something like that? I think the conversation about genre is a good one because people can clearly see, maybe you can crack that door open to say, okay, now the Psalms, we know the Psalms are poetry. I think most everybody could agree that the Psalms are poetry.
Yes.
And in fact, the Psalms reference a Leviathan, right? Like a sea monster that kills ships, okay? Maybe somebody who truly believed in inerrancy would say, no, there are Leviathan because it's written here. But I think that's the way I would have that conversation is by the time these are written down, the way that stories are written is that they're written as annals. They're written as sort of songs of things and hero and legend, right? It reminds me of Game of Thrones, right? They're like, do you think there'll be songs written about you, right? That's one of the things they keep saying. And that's sort of part of the genre. So I would start with genre. If they can't see that sometimes Jesus is being literal and sometimes he's telling a parable, and parables are meant to open up our brains, not close down our brains, I think that might be a way into some conversation. But for all times when we talk to people, we have to realize that faith can be like a faucet, and sometimes all we can do is have a couple of drips, and sometimes that's too much and we got to shut it off, right? Sometimes we can turn that baby all the way on. We can even turn it to hot. We can turn both on, right? Hot and cold, and let it flow freely. But for most people, you have to learn how far you can open that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, you can't change anybody else's minds.
Yeah.
They have to be open themselves.
Yep. So I want to say one more thing about Numbers, and that is it is in Numbers where we get priests who start to put together the worship service. And that's really cool because our Christian worship service was basically a Jewish worship service where we added communion onto the end of it. And so in Numbers, you get the blessing of Aaron at his ordination. Aaron becomes the first priest that's named. And in it, he gets this blessing, which is, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you his peace. So that blessing comes from Numbers. So I don't think Numbers is a great read overall, but it does give us the basis of our liturgy, which is really cool. Moving on to Deuteronomy. So this is the fifth book of the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the second law. Deutero means second, and onomy means like law, right? The second word. So in Deuteronomy, we get, can I use the word reboot? You know what
Yeah.
You know what a reboot is,
I think most people do.
Okay,
Yeah.
a reboot, like,
We don't like them usually.
we profess to not like them, but we go see them, don't we?
It's true. It's
Right?
true.
So think about how many Spider-Mans we've had in our lives.
All the new live-action Disney reboots.
All the new, yeah, thank you. Right, Mulan, that's supposed
It's
to come out.
not better,
And Lion King.
but it's new.
My kids only know Will Smith as the genie. They don't know him as Fresh Prince, and they don't know Robin Williams as the genie.
That's
That's
unfortunate.
so weird to me. Yeah, so we know what a reboot is. Deuteronomy is a reboot of Exodus. What does that mean? It means that a generation or two later, or maybe 100 years later, we actually don't know, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests it's even later than that, the people said, okay, we've got this character of Moses. We've got this story of Moses that's been told. But just like Spider-Man or Batman, we're going to rewrite our hero in a different way. All right? So in Exodus, if I can use Enneagram language, in Exodus, Moses is a 3. Okay? When things go wrong, he runs away. Right? When he kills somebody, he runs away. Then he comes back and he's like, let my people go. And then he complains the whole time that people won't listen to him. Right? That's the whole book of Exodus. Then in Deuteronomy, he becomes more of a 4. All right? So he becomes sort of poetic in a sense. Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 25 are 3 long sermons that Moses gives, one after the other, about how to frame their life as Exodus and what that means for their new life now. And it has a lot to do with the temple. So Deuteronomy starts to place a special emphasis on the temple that wasn't there in Exodus. Why? Because they didn't have a temple in Exodus. Okay? In Exodus, they had a tabernacle. They had something that they could put up, a tent they could put up in the desert, and they had the Ark of the Covenant. But by the time we get to Deuteronomy, they've built a temple, and now they're like, all of you people who are having communion like at home, you need to come to the temple. They didn't have communion, but I'm sort of phrasing it for us. You need to come to the temple. You can't have your sacrifices at home. You need to come to the temple, okay? So in it, the 10 Commandments get rewritten. And this is important for us as Lutherans because the Lutheran version of the 10 Commandments comes from Deuteronomy chapter 5.
Not from Exodus.
Not from Exodus 20. Lutherans are Deuteronomy 5. Moving on to Joshua. After Moses dies and the Hebrew people leave Exodus, Joshua takes over. And this shows up at the very end of the Deuteronomy story and the very end of Exodus, where Moses dies before they enter the promised land, and Joshua comes in. And this is a fictional story. It's also a good read. So far, I recommend Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua as good reads. It's a narrative. This one is a tall tale, if ever there were. In it, we have the Battle of Jericho, where there's a city like this one, and Joshua and his people surround the city. I think it's in chapter 7.
They walk around 7 times.
They walk around it 7 times. They blow their
Blowing
horns,
trumpets.
and then the walls fall down. The problem is, historically, that place where the walls fell down like 800 years before Joshua got there, right? So they're sort of claiming victory. They found a pile of ruins, and they're like, son, let me tell you about your grandfather, right?
I think it might be
got
a
that thing.
musician who wrote that text, because if I could say my music tumbled the walls
Yeah,
of
that's right.
a great city, then I would take that. I would take that claim.
Forget making a wine glass break. Right?
Yeah.
You shattered an entire city.
Right.
Joshua's a good read, and it's got this great line, which I think is in chapter 24, which is the one that hangs in my house, Joshua 24:15. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So they finally get to the promised land, the land of milk and honey, Joshua calls it. And they say, look, you can be anybody you want now. We are so far away from Exodus, but what I really want you to do is follow Yahweh, follow God. And that's when he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Fun fact, Yeshua, is the same name as Jesus of Nazareth, okay? In Hebrew, Jesus is Yeshua with a J, which sounds like a Y, okay? So this is Jesus' namesake. Jesus is a Greek word. The New Testament was written in Greek, so they translate it. Just like when we were in Costa Rica, if I said my name was Daniel, they would say Daniel, right? That Jesus is actually Joshua. Moving on to Judges. Judges is sort of a cool book. It's hard to read. It's definitely not a 101. It is a good read, though. What I really like about it is that when they get to the new place, they don't have a king yet. They haven't set up a monarchy. But they're like, what we really need is for people to solve matters, to rule us in a small sense. So if you and I have a gripe, we go find a judge to talk to. What's really cool about judges is that there are a lot of women who are involved in being judges. And one of them, Deborah, is named as a great leader in that movement. And there's a really bad leader called Abimelech. And I only mention that name because it shows up later remember how bad Abimelech was?
It's a fantastic name, though.
It's a good name, yeah. And again, this is trying to find order in chaos. So Judges is really cool, and shout out to anybody named Deborah on that one. Moving on, Ruth. Ruth is a story that doesn't really belong here in terms of when it was written. It's written much later, but it shows up here because the first line says, in the time of the judges, there was Ruth. And Ruth is a great read. It's a short read. It's like 4 or 5 pages, and it tells the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. I think you probably know the story. Wherever you go, I go. From now on, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth is an excellent sort of narrative story. Then we get to 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is the story of King David's rise to power that starts with a king named Saul, who is anointed as king by Samuel. So Samuel's the first priest who has so much power that he's kind of the king maker. He chooses who becomes king. Now they cast lots technically for Saul, and there's 2 stories competing in 1 Samuel about that. But Samuel is the first one who's like a leader whose voice comes from God. And he puts Saul in charge. Saul's a really good military leader, so they unite 12 tribes, which are Gad, Asher, Benjamin, all of those. They unite them together. They beat off the Philistines. They win the war, and then they make Saul king. But he's not really good. He was good in war. But he's not really good with like people and stuff. So they're like, okay, his sons are like not going to be good leaders. They're not going to be leaders. What are we going to do? And God tells Samuel, you need to go find Jesse. And Jesse has 7 sons, I think. And he's like looking at all of them. And he's like, these 6 aren't good. Don't you have another one? He's like, well, I got the scrawny kid, but he's out with the sheep. And then they bring him in, and that's David. David then signs up for the war. He defeats Goliath, and then he becomes king in 2 Samuel. And finally, I want to talk a little bit. 1st and 2 Samuel are also good reads. I want to talk about kings. Now, in 1st and 2 Kings, we are shifting genre for the first time. Everything else, other than Leviticus, which was law, everything else is a narrative genre. But 1st and 2 Kings is trying to be history, except they don't really have great history. There aren't really historians as such, but they write down who the kings are through time. And in it, we start getting the stories of Elijah, who is sort of a replacement for Samuel as a prophet who takes over and helps, and also Elisha after Elijah is gone. So 1st and 2 Kings are trying to be a history, but it's kind of like a textbook that's full of errors. And you and I both know textbooks are always full of errors.
Or like Game of Thrones, where they talk about the history of all of the ancestors to just set precedent for...
That's right. To the victor go the spoils.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who write these stories. What I like about 1st and 2 Kings is they don't sugarcoat it when there's a bad king. When we meet together next time, we'll talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is on the other side of Babylonian captivity. And it is a very different genre. It's much more nationalistic, where this one's trying to be historical and is as historical as one could be in 587. So these are the books of the Bible that lead up to Babylonian captivity. When the Babylonians come in, they sack the city, they destroy the wall, they end the dynasty, which is why 1st and 2nd Kings are written and changed. They're sort of finalized in captivity. And the Babylonians take all of the wealthy people who would be writing, and they take them to Babylon. So those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through. I feel like I could say something about each of the books now, and I hope that's everyone's takeaway, is that you're at least getting familiar. You maybe have a direction for, if you want to start reading in the Old Testament, you have a direction for where to start now.
Well, that's right, and whoever suggested that we talk about genres, a few of you did, thank you so much. Thanks for participating online. I hope this has been helpful for you, and we wish you blessings on your week. And hopefully you can find ways to study these things, or at least look them up on Wikipedia.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. See you at 11 o'clock for contemporary worship.
God bless y'all. Bye.